Well, how's everybody doing? Whew. I'm glad you guys are here anyway. I didn't scare everybody away from last week, so. Before I get started covering the material today, I just want to point out some books I brought because I'm sure some of you are going to want to do some follow-up study on your own after today's discussion. So I brought several books up here. I reference a couple of these in my notes when I go through this particular presentation. But if you want to do some further study, if you want to read some heart-wrenching stories about what life is like in an Islamic society. I got so many, they're falling off the podium up here. Let me just point out a few of these. This one was written by Phil and Julie Parshall. Phil and Julie Parshall were missionaries to Muslims in Bangladesh for 20 plus years. And this is a collection, it's called Lifting the Veil. This is a collection of stories that Phil and Julie Parshall collected from women who came to them as they were missionaries, recounting to Phil and Julie some of the difficulties they faced as Muslim women in a Muslim world. And so lest you think I'm exaggerating in some of the things that I'm saying today, these are first-hand accounts of what goes on with a Muslim woman in that society. Parshall, P-A-R-S-H-A-L-L. And it's called Lifting the Veil. Along a similar line, I've got another book up here called Behind the Veils of Yemen. Behind the Veils of Yemen by Audra Grace Shelby. And I'll leave some of these, I'll leave all these in the basket up here so you can look at them during the break or after class so you can, if you want to, you can write down the author's name and title. Cruel and Usual Punishment. Cruel and Usual, not unusual. Cruel and Usual Punishment by Noni Darwish. Noni Darwish is the daughter of a Muslim martyr, Shahid. She grew up in Syria, or Egypt. Was it Egypt or Syria? Egypt, yeah. Egyptian woman, grew up as a Muslim woman, now a Christian. She's a national speaker, nationally recognized speaker. She speaks on issues of Islam, and particularly women. Cruel and Usual Punishment, the terrifying global implications of Islamic law. But about the first half of this book is dedicated to women's issues and what women go through. And she describes the marriage process and the divorce process and how multiple marriages, polygamy in Islam, causes so much inner conflict within the family. And she gives a first-hand account of what that's like. For example, she talks about in Egypt particularly when a man completes a marriage contract. That's called a nikah. The marriage contract has space on the contract for the name of 4 different women. Because Muslim men can marry up to 4 wives. And she talks about the implications behind that and how it builds distrust among the different wives about who's the better wife than the other and all kinds of conflict. You can imagine. Yeah. Yeah, who's the queen? Princess. This is a book that came out 10 or 15 years ago. Was a New York Times bestseller. Princess, The True Story of Life Behind the Veil in Saudi Arabia by Jean Sasson. Very, very interesting book. You can probably find used copies of this all over the place. I bought this one used for like $3, I think. No, 1992, so it's 20 years ago that she wrote that. The Imam's Daughter by Hannah Shah. This one just came out last year. Hannah Shah was the daughter of an imam in London. This is in the UK. Not an Islamic society, but she lived in a Islamic pocket, an Islamic neighborhood within the UK that was mostly Muslims. And she talks about her experience as the daughter of an imam. And I won't go into great detail. I'm going to leave that to you to read the book. Because this is captivating. When I started reading this, I couldn't put it down. I honestly couldn't put it down.
Were these authors killed?
Oh yeah. Well, she talks about how she was chased in this book When she finally fled the house, her family tried to come find her and hunt her down to kill her. So she actually writes under a pen name. That's not her real name, obviously, for obvious reasons. Veiled Atrocities. True Stories of Oppression in Saudi Arabia by Sami al-Rabah. And then finally, this is actually the other side of the coin. How do you minister to Muslim women? This is basically for the women in this room, because in an Islamic society, or in Islamic culture, it is inappropriate for men to approach women. It has to be woman to woman. They have an extreme obligation for the separation of the genders. You know, a man will never be in the presence of an Islamic woman whom he's not related to. And so if you want to minister to Muslim women, that's pretty much the sole domain of Christian women. Woman to woman, that's the name of the book, Woman to Woman. And we've had these on the table in the back by Joy Lowen. And she gives some tips and some suggestions on the best ways to meet up with Muslim women and begin building a relationship with them. I had the chance to hear her speak in this past October when we were at a conference of Muslim ministries back in Minneapolis. So her name is Joy Lowen, Loewen. She lives up in Canada, I think Toronto. Woman to Woman by Joy Lowen. So I'll leave these up here. You guys can take a look at them during the break or afterwards. And I'm going to make reference to a few of these as we go through the material today. Okay, let's open with a word of prayer, and we'll get going. Father, we thank you again for this opportunity. We thank you for just the blessing of being able to meet together like this. Lord, we ask your presence as we go through this material. Some of it, as heart-wrenching as it may be, Lord, that you would help to open our eyes to the condition of many Muslim women around the world, and help us to be more sensitive to what they're going through, so that we may reach out to them in love and compassion. And we want to give you the honor and glory in everything that we do today. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, how are we doing on sound? You guys can hear me okay? Okay, because I didn't bring the microphone today because it was cutting out so much last week. So, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Real quick.
Women can minister to women, not to men, right?
Right.
Is there a restriction common for men? Can non-Muslim men minister to Muslim women?
For the most part, no. Now, here in the West, there's some exceptions to that. Her question was, women must minister to women, but can a non-Muslim man minister to a Muslim woman? For the most part, no. But here in the West, there's a little bit more liberal stance on that. In Muslim societies and Islamic societies, no. That's completely forbidden, for reasons we'll talk about during the talk today. But here in the West, for example, my wife and I, some time back, went down to the Santa Monica 3rd Street Promenade. And we found an Islamic table there set up on the promenade, and there was a man and a woman behind the table. And I got engaged in a conversation with the woman, and we kind of went off to one side of the table and continued our discussion, and my wife started talking to the man. So there's a little more, and especially in an open forum like that, there's a little more freedom to do some of those things here than they would have in Muslim societies. But
yeah, I was in Saudi a couple of years for a company that made oil drilling equipment, but there you had to be very careful
Oh, yeah.
in witnessing because
Yeah.
you could go to jail for it.
oh yeah,
And you didn't want to look in the direction of a woman. And we had a driller that was looking at this younger woman. She had a nail on her horse, and a police officer hit him in the back of the head with his rifle.
oh yeah, yeah.
It's not an open society over
Right, not over there at all. All right, we're going to be addressing the issue of women in Islam. I'm going to be moving very fast through the material because I've got several video clips to play. But I have a book up here called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. This was actually published by the Gallup polling organization, very well-respected polling group. And supposedly they took a statistical sample of Muslims around the world, roughly 2/3 of the Muslim population, what a billion Muslims really think. And they polled the Muslims around the world using statistical analysis and very targeted questions to get an idea of what Muslims really think in Muslim societies about the issue of women. And the two co-authors are John Esposito. John Esposito is in charge of the Muslim Studies Center at Georgetown University in Washington, an Islamic Studies Center funded by millions of dollars in Saudi oil money, so he's never going to say anything negative about Islam. And the other co-author is Dalia Mogahed. And Dalia Mogahed is President Obama's advisor on Muslim affairs. And she wrote this book before she became before Obama was elected. But that gives you some idea of the high regard held in the Muslim community for the two authors of this book. And supposedly they took this statistical sample about what Muslims around the world think about women. Now, when you look at pro-Islamic websites, you discover something very interesting. Many pro-Islamic websites talk about how Islam upholds women, how Islam, exalts women, protects women. And when you look back in history, some of the things that Muhammad implemented when he became the Muslim leader actually did elevate women's status from their previous condition. For example, in pre-Islamic times, there was a lot of infanticide. Little baby girls were sacrificed to the different pagan gods. Muhammad did away with the practice of infanticide. In pre-Islamic times, men could divorce their wives as often as they wanted to and remarry them ad infinitum. Divorce, remarry, divorce, remarry, divorce, remarry. So when Muhammad came on the scene, he actually put some limitations on those divorces, and we'll talk about that a little bit later today. When Muhammad came on the scene, he actually gave women inheritance rights, which they didn't possess in pre-Islamic times. He gave them certain rights of inheritance. And so when you read this sort of information on pro-Islamic websites that Islam actually elevated women from their pre-Islamic status, that's true to some extent. But the question we need to ask is, does Islam elevate women today in what we would consider a 21st century society? What does Islam have to say about women? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, considering this Gallup poll, what 1 billion Muslims really think. When they polled these Muslims around the world, the pollsters came up with some very interesting statistics, if I can get my tongue untied. Statistics, for example, they found that many of the people polled declared that women are equal with men in status. Islam condemned pre-Islamic practices degrading and oppressing women, some of those issues that I just talked about just a moment ago. Islam gave women the right of inheritance and the right of individual dependent ownership unhampered by the father, the husband, or the brother, the son, or anyone else. And so it seems to suggest that Muslims around the world think that Islam actually helped women in their status as they were viewed from in pre-Islamic times, and that's somewhat true. But the question we need to ask is, what do the basic teachings of Islam say about women? Does Islam really protect women? When we look at the status of women today, and what Muhammad had to say about it, and what the Quran has to say about it, and what the Hadith records about women, would we view these writings in Islamic sacred literature as being beneficial or exalting women, holding women in high regard? Are women treated equally in Islam? And if they are, where do Muslims find justification for that? One more thing, when we look at what Muhammad says and what the scriptures say about Islam, we need to separate what the writings say from current reality. And I don't want to suggest that everything that we're going to be talking about today applies to all women worldwide, all Muslim women worldwide, because that's simply not true. But many of the things we're going to be discussing today do apply to certain, I would suggest maybe a majority of Muslim women around the world, because that's what we see when we look around the world. But for example, look at this picture right here. I took this picture in Dearborn, Michigan a few years ago of a couple walking down the fair route there, the festival route. And for all intents and purposes, they look to be like any other happy American couple. Both of them are pushing a stroller, they both have a smile on their face, and they seem to be happy with their situation. And that may well be. But the question we're going to answer today is this. If there are happy marriages within Islam, is that because of the teachings of Islam or in spite of the teachings of Islam? Big difference. Because of the teachings of Islam or in spite of the teachings of Islam? The first issue I want to address is, does Islam actually protect women? Because this is one of the claims made by Muslim apologists today. Islam protects women. Yeah, you can move that. A man has an obligation to protect his wife. And that's true. When we read the Quran and we look at a couple verses, particularly Surah 4, verse 19, it says, "O ye who believe, you're forbidden to inherit women against their will, nor should you treat them with harshness." So don't treat your women with harshness. That seems to be nonsensical. We would agree with that. We're not to treat women with harshness. That's something that we as Christians can agree with as well. Surah 65:6, "Lodge with them where you lodge according to your means, and do not injure them." So don't injure your wives. Well, yeah, I think we can agree with that. Injuring your wives is probably not a good thing. But again, when we look at other verses in the Quran, we seem to find contradictions. Just like we've seen all along. The Quran is internally contradictory. And here's one of the contradictory verses that we see that contradicts these two verses we just looked at. And this one is called, it's actually in Surah 4, verse 34. Surah 4, verse 34 says, "Men are the protectors and maintainers of women because Allah has made one of them to excel the other, and because they spend of their wealth to support them from their means. Therefore, the righteous women are guarded in the husband's absence. As to those women on whose part you see or suspect ill conduct, admonish them, abandon them to beds, and beat them." Now remember the verses we said just a moment ago? Don't harm your wives. This one says, if you suspect ill conduct on the part of your wives, beat them. Now, again, this seems to be a contradictory statement. Now, many Muslim apologists will assert that the term there, beat them, sometimes is metaphorically. It's not actually talking about, actually a physical beating. Other Muslim apologists will say, well, yeah, it says beat them, but it really means to tap them lightly, like tap them on the shoulder like with a toothpick or with a feather. But when you look at this verse and when you place it in context, that argument doesn't hold any water. Why do I say that? Because when you look at this verse, you see what's going on. And what's going on is a three-step process called progressive discipline. Any of you that are in management or supervisors, you know what progressive discipline is. When you have an employee that is misbehaving, you give them a verbal warning first, and you document that. If the action continues, you no longer give them a verbal warning, you give them some time off without pay. If the action continues, ultimately you're going to fire them. They're going to lose their job. That's progressive discipline. That's exactly what we see going on in this verse. If you suspect disobedience from your wives, number one, you're to give them a verbal warning. As to those women on whose part you see or suspect ill conduct, admonish them. Give them a verbal warning. Say, Allah is not pleased with you disobeying me because I am your husband. You are my wife. You are to obey me. Number two, if the verbal warning, if the admonishment doesn't achieve the desired results, you're to banish them to separate beds. You can't sleep with them. And what that means is that actually dishonors the wife. It brings shame and dishonor to her, because in a Muslim society, part of the woman's value, part of the woman's worth is determined by her ability to produce offspring for her husband. And by the man admonishing the woman and then abandoning her to bed, refusing to sleep with her, he is saying to his wife, in effect, I dishonor you. You're bringing dishonor to me. I'm not going to give you the honor of bearing children for me. If that doesn't achieve the desired results, the third and final step, which is supposed to be above and beyond all the others, is to beat them. Now, as the most severe step of the disciplinary process intended to achieve the desired results, does the term beat them actually mean tap them on the shoulder with a toothpick? See, it doesn't really measure up. You can't justify that based on the text itself. This is a disciplinary process that the Quran seems to suggest. Islamic legal jurist Imam Shafi, in this book up here, this is one of the four manuals of Sharia law called Reliance of the Traveler. This is from the Shafi school of Islamic law. There are 4 schools of Islamic law. This is one of them. Imam Shafi tells us of the many possible behaviors that will result in a woman being beaten. For example, if the wife responds to the husband coldly, or if he asks her to come to bed and she refuses, or he finds her averse to him, or she leaves home without his permission, or if she allows anyone else in the home without his permission, or if she is found alone with a non-family member male. These and other things can result in a woman being beaten. And this is exactly what happens in many Islamic societies today. Scholar Abdul Latif Mushtahiri says, if admonishing and sexual desertion fail to bring forth results, and the woman is of a cold and stubborn type, the Quran bestows on the man the right to straighten her out by way of punishment and beating, provided he does not break her bones nor shed blood. And we find many examples of this in the Hadith. You have them in there in your notes. I won't go through all of them for the sake of time. Sahih al-Bukhari records Muhammad saying, none of you should flog his wife as he flogs a slave and then have sexual intercourse with her in the last part of the day. What Muhammad was saying essentially is, if you beat your wife like you beat your slave, don't expect to go to bed with her that night. It's not going to happen. That's what this hadith means. Amnesty International, a couple years ago, released a report on the plight of women in Pakistan. Pakistan is a Muslim society, strict Muslim society, adheres to strict Sharia law. And according to the results of this study by Amnesty International, over 90% of married women, 90% of married women report being kicked, slapped, beaten, or sexually abused when husbands were dissatisfied by their cooking or cleaning, or when the women had failed to bear a child or had given birth to a girl instead of a boy. Women are beaten, or worse, for failing to give birth to a boy. Think about that for a moment. Let's go back to Biology 101. Who's responsible for determining the sex or the gender of an offspring? The male, right? So why are the women punished? Here's an article I printed this morning. I found it on the internet this morning, just to show you that this is the reality. January 30th, 2012. Afghan woman killed for having a baby girl. Her husband told her, she had had 2 previous baby girls. Her husband told her, if you give me another baby girl, I'm going to kill you. And he did just that. This is the reality. I have some friends that are missionaries in Morocco. They're in a town in central Morocco. They've been there for 6 years now, Christine? Something like that, yeah, 6 years. He sent me an email last year. He didn't know that I was going to be talking about this particular subject. He included this email in a regular update that I get from him. And he says, in chapter 4, verse 34 of the Quran, God tells men to beat women whom they fear rebellion. This is his words. He says, when I was on vacation, I was coming home with a friend from a cafe when I saw a man hitting a woman. I immediately ran to the man and restrained him, pushing him about 30 feet away. He told me that the woman was his wife, as if that made it okay. After a few moments, I released him and they went their separate ways. A few weeks later, I was in a shop buying some peanuts, and we got on to the topic of marriage with the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper asked me if I hit my wife, to which I said no. Then he asked me again to make sure that I heard him right. And when I answered again in the negative, he told me that they hit their wives. It's just a normal way of life in that society. This is in Morocco. This is one of the more liberal Muslim societies. Morocco is actually fairly liberal compared to other Islamic societies, and yet this is what's going on. We see in the hadith where Muhammad actually hit his wife, Aisha. Aisha got up in the middle of the night because Muhammad got out of bed and started walking around the desert. She went to chase him, to find him, to see where he was going. He discovered her, and it's recorded in the hadith that Aisha says, he hit me and it hurt. He punched me in the middle of the chest and it caused me pain. Don't flog your wife as you flog your slave. Pay attention to this next video, this first video clip that we're going to watch. This is a Muslim scholar that talks about this very issue. Lest you think I'm exaggerating today, this is what Muslim scholars say about this particular issue.
This is a demonstration of الأوروبية في الوقت الحاضر بتنشد الرجل القوام. أنا يعني هدي المشاهدين سريعا كده بعض إحصائيات سريعا عن هذا الأمر. 90% من نساء بريطانيا ما بيحبوش يتزوجوا من الرجل الضعيف اللي أول ما تحصل أول مشكلة أو أي مشكلة يقعد يعيط يقول لك لا ده الراجل ده عامل شكل حريم، احنا عاوزين راجل. قضية الضرب دي شبهة خطيرة جدا.
نعم.
واحدة معانا مولانا.
أقول إن الله كرم المرأة بهذه العقوبة، عقوبة الضرب. كيف؟
كرمها بالضرب؟
إي والله.
مش معقول. كيف؟
قال نبينا صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وسلم: ولا تضرب الوجه
الله
ولا تقبح. شوف كرمها، إن ضربها لا يضربها على وجهها، حتى وهو يضربها لا يسبها ولا يشتمها. عجيب. إذن هو يضرب للتأديب، وإذا ضرب لا يزيد عن 10، وإذا ضرب لا يكسر عظما ولا يقطع لحما ولا يكسر سنا ولا يفقع عينا. أدب عند الضرب. إذا ضرب عند التأديب لا يرفع يده إلى أعلى بل يضربها بحذاء صدره. كل هذا تكريم للمرأة. هي تحتاج إلى تأديب. فكيف يؤدبها زوجها؟ بالوعظ. فإن لم ترتدع ولا تنزجر بالهجران، فإن لم تنزجر بالضرب، وجعل شروطا للضرب: لا تضرب الوجه ولا تقبح. وأنت تضرب لا تقبح، لا تسب ولا تشتم، يا ابنة كذا أنت كذا، لا، ممنوع هذا في الإسلام.
يا مولانا يضربها بإيه؟
يضربها، نعم،
بعصا.
صحيح.
بإيه؟
قالوا إن ضربها يضربها ضربا غير مبرح لا يترك أثرا. يضربها بعصا قصيرة، وإذا ضربها لا يضربها على وجهها ولا على أماكن الرأس التي تؤذي، بل يضربها على بدنها ويفرق الضرب. كل هذا اختيار لإجراء العقوبة، لكن هذا لا يكون إلا عند استحالة الوسائل السابقة.
So there's an etiquette to beating. And see, beating honors the woman because she's in need of discipline. See, these are not my words. These are words of Muslim scholars themselves. That's why I have these video clips in here, because this is the reality around the world today. How many of you guys remember the movie that came out in 1991, 1992 called Not Without My Daughter with Sally Field? Yeah, that movie was, little did we know, it was ahead of its time. I've got a short video clip here of an excerpt from that movie. I got to turn the sound up because it's a little bit low, but check this out.
I know how much you miss your family, how guilty they make you feel. I know the kind of pressure they're putting on you. I know you want to spend some time here. I promise you we'll come back. We'll spend time here. But we can't stay here. This is a backward, primitive country. I won't live here. I won't bring up my daughter here. How can you even consider raising Mahtab here? Don't you see how they treat women?
I know it's the right decision if you just give it a chance. No. For all of us, for you and for Mahtab.
No, you can't.
I'm a highly qualified doctor. They're desperate for doctors in Iran. I could do a lot of good here.
Please.
Besides, I'm a Muslim. This is where I should be. This is where my family should be. Look, I know it seems harsh, but it's the best thing for all of us. Mahtab could learn real values here.
No, I won't stay here. You can't keep me.
Now, you listen to me. You're in my country now. You're my wife. You do as I say. You understand me? We're staying here.
Pretty realistic. Very realistic. Let me crank this down a little bit so I don't blow you away with the next one. So, Islam protects women? I think not. Women's social status. Let's talk about the social status of women. What does the Hadith, what does the Quran say about the social status of women? Well, when you look at the Hadith, women are viewed nothing more as possessions. Something that a man owns. When you look at the Hadith of Al-Bukhari, for example, in volume 3, book 34, Hadith number 264, there's two businessmen conducting a business transaction. One has a lot of money, one has some wives. And one says, I will give you half of my wealth, and you may look at my two wives, and whichever of the two you may choose, I'll divorce her, and you can marry her. Simple business transaction. I give you money, I take one of your wives in exchange. Women are viewed as chattel. They're business, they're possessions, and nothing more. The Hadith of Ibn Majah: when one is given a woman, a servant, or a cattle, one should seize its forehead and pray to Allah. So women are compared to cattle and other possessions. History of Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari is the Islamic historian whom I'm going to read from you a little bit later. But in volume 9 of Al-Tabari says, treat women well, for they are like domestic animals, and you do not, they're like domestic animals with you, and do not possess anything for themselves. So women are viewed as nothing more than another domestic animal to possess. Here's an example.
I'm traveling right across the country to find out. The first thing I notice is that women are still almost invisible on the streets.
There are hordes and hordes of men out on the streets. You really have to avoid them. You have to walk carefully, otherwise they will make it a habit to brush up against a woman.
But you can still find child brides. Girls as young as 7 are being sold into marriage. I'm on my way to meet one such girl who lives with a family at the edge of Herat, where the desert begins.
اسمش شما؟ شاناز. چند سال؟ 14.
How old were you when your father sold you?
7 ساله.
How did you feel when your father told you that you had been sold?
احساس غمگین شدم.
It's difficult for us to speak to Shanaz because her mother-in-law and her husband keep coming into the room.
Although we have permission to speak to her, Shanaz's husband is concerned because, as it turns out, she had burnt herself to protest her marriage.
Tell me why you decided to burn yourself.
از چیز از ننگ مردم که امیق ماما که می آمدم بس به اینجی که می آمدم می گفتم پیار مردم می دادن که پیار تو ایت چیزی بود ایت چیزی بود مادر تو اینجی عروس شد خود تو اینجی عروس کرد خود من از زمین ننگ گفتم باش که خودسوزی کنم که دیگه بومارم دیگه اینا من نبینم.
How old were you when you decided to burn yourself?
11 ساله. بله.
So there's a young girl, 7 years old, was sold off by her parents to pay off a debt. Why? Because they're nothing more than a possession, to be sold and traded. She protested, set herself on fire at 11 years old to try to commit suicide. Women's social status. Women are mere possessions. Women are controlled by their husbands. This goes back to the same verse we were looking at earlier, Surah 4, verse 34, which says, men are the protectors and maintainers of women. And what that means is that men have absolute control over what their wives say and do. A Muslim woman cannot leave her house without the permission of her husband, except in certain situations. A Saudi feminist describes an Arab woman as a prisoner in her own home. She doesn't have any rights of her own. Her rights belong to her husband. A Muslim scholar by the name of Dr. Muhammad Ali al-Hashimi wrote a book several years ago. You can find it online. It's called The Ideal Muslima. The Ideal Muslim Woman, the Ideal Muslim Wife, the Ideal Muslima. You have an excerpt from the book in your notes. I won't read the whole thing for the sake of time, but let me just read one or two of these paragraphs to show you what the woman's rights is toward her husband. One of the most important ways in which the Muslim woman obeys her husband is by respecting his wishes with regard to the permissible pleasures of daily life, such as social visits, food, dress, speech, etc. The more she responds to his wishes in such matters, the happier and more enjoyable the couple's lives become, and the closer it is to the spirit and teachings of Islam. Do you see whose wishes are in focus here? Men and women are treated equal? It is not permitted for a woman who believes in Allah to allow anyone into her husband's home whom he dislikes, or to go out when he does not want her to, or to obey anyone else against him, or to forsake his bed, or to hit him. If he is wrong, let her come to him until he is pleased with her, and so forth. It is a great honor for a woman to take care of her husband every morning and evening, and wherever he goes, treating him with gentleness and good manners, which fulfill his life with joy, tranquility, and stability. That's the ideal Muslim woman. Make sure your husband is pleased with everything you do. You have no ability or no desire, no right to please yourself. It's all about him. So, women are controlled by their husbands. Women must never be alone in the presence of another unrelated man. This is one of the requirements of Sharia law. In this book up here, Reliance of the Traveler by Imam Shafi, from the Shafi school of Islamic law. Imam Shafi says, a husband may permit his wife to leave the house for a lesson in sacred law or for the invocation of Allah, to see her friends or to go any place in the town. He has to give her permission. But it is not lawful for the wife to leave the house except by permission of her husband, though she may do so with permission when there's a pressing need, such as if there's a medical emergency. Nor may the wife permit anyone to enter her husband's home unless he agrees, even their unmarriageable kin. Nor may she be alone with a non-family member male under any circumstances. A Muslim woman will never be alone with an unrelated male member of the society. She can never be alone with somebody that she's not married to, a male. And this was actually brought to light a couple of years ago in Saudi Arabia when an American woman of Jordanian descent went to Saudi Arabia to conduct business. She was an American citizen. She traveled to Saudi Arabia to conduct a business transaction. They were meeting in the office complex of their company in Saudi Arabia. The power went out. They lost air conditioning. So in order to continue the business discussion, they went to a nearby Starbucks. Now in Saudi Arabia, Starbucks are segregated. They have a woman's section, they have a man's section, and then they have a family section. Because the genders are not allowed to mix unless they're related to one another. Well, she obviously couldn't sit in the female section and he in the male section and conduct business that way, so they sat together in the family section. But the morality police, the Muwatta, morality police patrol Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and many other Islamic countries looking for people violating Sharia law. The morality police came into Starbucks, saw this unrelated couple sitting together in the family section, arrested the woman, jailed her overnight, and beat her. This made headline news. It made international news. She was released from jail the next day, bruised and crying. Why? Because she had the gall to sit with an unrelated married man in the public. Women must never be in the vicinity or in the presence of an unrelated married man or unrelated man. Women are deficient in intelligence. Did you know that? According to the Hadith, according to Muhammad's sayings, women are deficient in intelligence. Several Hadith, in particular the Sahih al-Bukhari, the most authoritative Hadith collection for Sunni Muslims, there are literally dozens of examples where Muhammad is quoted as saying, "You women, you curse frequently, you're ungrateful to your husbands. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you." Now, where do they get this idea from, that women are deficient in intelligence? Well, if you go back in Islamic history, when you read the history of Al-Tabari, remember Al-Tabari was a 9th century Islamic scholar. He wrote a massive, what's called the history of the world through the Islamic worldview, through Islamic lenses. I've got the entire 39 volumes set at home on my bookshelf. This is volume 1, which talks about the beginning of time, the creation account, and the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden. And when we read the narrative of the fall of Adam and Eve, let me just read it for you here. Satan whispered to Eve about the tree and succeeded in taking her to it. Then he made it seem good to Adam, and he continued. When Adam felt a need for her and he called her, she said, "No, unless you go there," talk about the tree. So when he went, she said again, "No, not unless you eat from this tree." He continued. They both ate from it, and their secret parts became apparent to them. When God asked Adam what had caused his trouble, he replied, "Eve, my Lord. Eve did it. The woman did it." Whereupon God said, this is God punishing Eve for tempting Adam. God said to Eve, "Now it is my obligation to make her bleed once a month, as she has made this tree bleed. I also must make her stupid, though I created her intelligent. And I must make her suffer pregnancy and birth with difficulty, although I made it easy for her to be pregnant and give birth. Were it not for the affliction that affected Eve, the women of this world would not menstruate, and they would be intelligent. And when pregnant, they would give birth easily." So it all goes back to the fall of Eve, Eve being the first one to be tempted by Satan way back in the garden. That's why women have menstrual periods today, and that's why women are half as intelligent as men, according to Islam. Did you guys know that? Women are deficient in intellect. This is where that idea comes from. Here's another video clip.
يقول صلى الله عليه وسلم إن المرأة ما رأيت من ناقصات عقل ودين أذهب للب الرجل الحازم من إحداكن إلى آخر الحديث. ولكن هذا الحديث وأمثاله قد فهمه الجهال على غير وجهه، وأوله المغرضون المفسدون على غير المراد به، بل جعلوه مع الأسف بسبب جهلهم وصفاقتهم وحمقهم وعداوتهم للإسلام وأهله، جعلوه دليلا على إهانة الإسلام للمرأة وحطه من قدرها ووصفها بما لا يليق بها. هذه الأحاديث من أعظم الأدلة على حماية الإسلام للمرأة وكفالته لحقوقها وإحاطتها بسياج من الشفقة والرحمة، حيث بيّنت أن الاعوجاج في المرأة من أصل الخلقة، هكذا أراد الله عز وجل لها أن تكون. فلا بد للرجل إذن أن يسايرها وأن يصبر عليها، فلا يكلفها شططا ولا يقصرها على ما لا تطيق، ولا أن يحملها على شيء يخالف فطرتها وخلقتها التي خلقها الله عز وجل عليها. كما يجب عليها أن يغض الطرف عن أخطائها ويتحمل زلاتها وهفواتها، وأن يوطن نفسه على ما قد يصدر منها من حمق أو جهل، لأن ذلك جزء من طبيعتها وخلقتها. كما أن هذه العاطفة الجياشة لدى المرأة التي ربما تغلب على عقلها أحيانا، وهذا الضعف الذي جبلت عليه هو سر جاذبية المرأة وسحرها لزوجها، وهو مصدر إغرائها له، وهو من أسباب تقوية العلاقة بين الزوجين. وهذه آية من آيات الله العجيبة، قوة المرأة في ضعفها، إغراؤها وسحرها في عاطفتها التي ربما أحيانا تغلب على عقلها.
But did you see that? This is the way Allah created women. This is what makes them attractive, because they have surging emotions. They're kind of clumsy and stupid. That's what makes them attractive to men. Essentially, is what he was saying. So, women's social status. A woman's testimony is equal to half that of a man. Now remember, one of the arguments that Muslims make is that women and men are equal. But when you look at the Quran and when you look at the Hadith, this is one place, one particular area where they're not equal at all. If a man has offspring, and he has male offspring and he has female offspring, a daughter and a son, when that man dies, the inheritance is not divvied up equally between his male child and his female child. The male child will get twice as much of an inheritance as the female will. Is that equal? Yet this is what the Quran says, this is what the Hadith says. Surah 2, verse 282. Well, I don't want to get to there yet. That's talking about testimony, which we'll get to in a minute. But woman's testimony is equal to half that of a man. That is in the Hadith. When the female is killed accidentally in an Islamic society, there's a certain concept called indemnity or blood money that has to be paid when murders occur in Islamic societies. Blood money is paid to the relatives of the one that's murdered. Indemnity. Blood money of a girl is only half that of a blood money or indemnity of a male that's killed accidentally. So the indemnity of a female is only half that of a man. Women. By far. Yeah. And then when you look at what Muhammad said, he said essentially that women are the inhabitants of hell. Women are, essentially, according to the Hadith, women were created by Allah to stoke the fires of hell. The Prophet said in Sahih al-Bukhari, book 1, or volume 1, book 2, number 28, the Prophet said, I was shown the hellfire in that the majority of its dwellers were women who were ungrateful. Majority of the people in hell are women. He passed by the women and said, O women, give alms, as I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire were you women. And on and on and on it goes. I've got several narrations of Hadith there in the notes. This is what the Hadith seems to suggest women were created for. They're the majority of the inhabitants of hell. Also in the Hadith, women are compared to dogs. So Islam upholds the value of women? Well, when you read the Hadith, narrated Aisha. Aisha was Muhammad's favorite wife. He married her at 6 years old, consummated the marriage at 9 years old, and she was faithful to him until he died. He died when Muhammad was 63 and she was 18 years old. She was left a widow at 18. Narrated Aisha. Aisha is one woman that is quoted in the hadith. There are very few women who are quoted in the hadith, which suggests that Aisha held some position of authority. Because when a hadith quotes a woman, that's saying something, because women are not really highly regarded. Aisha recorded, "The things which annul the prayers were mentioned before me. They said prayer is annulled by a dog, a donkey, and a woman if they pass in front of the praying people." This is what Aisha heard Muhammad say. The prayers of a righteous man are annulled by three things: a dog, a donkey, and a woman. If a dog, a donkey, or a woman passes in front of a praying man, his prayers are void. Aisha picked up on this right away. She said to Muhammad, this is Aisha recording, "I said, you have made us women equal to dogs." Muhammad didn't dispute that. He didn't say anything in response to that. Narrated Aisha, "It's not good that you people have made us women equal to dogs and donkeys." So on and so forth. Women are responsible for bad luck. Did you know that? According to Imam Maliki is one of the other schools of Islamic law that Sharia comes from. Imam Malik says, Malik related to me from Abu Hazim ibn Dinar and from Sa'al ibn Sa'ad as-Sa'idi that the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, Muhammad said, "If it exists, it is in a horse, a woman, and a house," meaning ill luck. Women are responsible for bad luck. Ill luck is in a house, a woman, and a horse. So women are responsible for bad luck. Let's touch on the issue of women in divorce, marriage and divorce. We're going to spend quite a bit of time here on the issue of marriage and divorce because this is another area where Islam does not give equal rights to men and women. According to Surah 4, verse 3, men can marry up to 4 wives. That's why I said in the marriage contract that Nani Darwish talks about in her book, Cruel and Unusual Punishment, there's a spot on the marriage contract for the name of 4 different wives. Because this is allowed in Islam, according to Surah 4, verse 3. Surah 4, verse 3 says, "If you fear you should not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. Up to 4 wives. But can a woman marry up to 4 husbands? Nope. Now, why were men permitted to marry 4 wives? Well, if you go back in history, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, Muhammad actually instituted this particular allowance to provide a way to care for widows who were left widows when their men went off into battle and were killed in battle. This is supposedly a way to provide for the ongoing support of widows whose husbands had been killed in nearby skirmishes. And so they say this is one of the things that Islam and Muhammad and Allah instigated to give women more value in society. Because prior to this, widows were just left on their own. They had nobody to care for them, they had nobody to provide for them, and they were kind of left to scrounge for their own. And many of them died because they had nobody to support them. So this allowed Muslim men to marry additional wives to provide for those widows. But there's another way this has been interpreted. Why has God also allowed men to marry widows or to marry multiple wives? Here's one view.
الفقهاء قالوا التعدد له شروط. لو أن الزوجة مريضة يحتاج إلى والزوج يحتاج إلى يعني أن يقضي شهوته أو وطره الجنسي، أو أن الزوج شهوته يعني رجل قوي جنسيا والزوجة لا تكفيه، فله الحق في أن يعدد. أو أن الزوج
يعني إذا الفقهاء أجازوا فكرة التعدد لإشباع الرغبة الجنسية لو عنده
نعم لو عنده
حتى لو كان ده بيبقى فترة محددة، لأن الإنسان حتى لو عنده طاقة زايدة شوية في العشرينات والثلاثينات هتخف لما يكبر.
نعم، وحتى لو هتخف في هذه الفترة
يتجوز.
كيف يعني أين يفضي رغبته؟
يتجوز
اللي هو الحق من الزوج
لمجرد إشباع الرغبة.
نعم، وإلا سيشبعها في حرام.
No, so that's why men can marry multiple wives. Now, even though the Quran suggests that men can marry up to 4 wives, when we look at Muhammad, he didn't keep to his own stipulations. Muhammad had multiple wives. He was given the right to marry as many women as he desired. Surah 4, verse 3, you can take widows of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. But when Muhammad had married more than 4, he was confronted by his people as to why he was not keeping to his previous revelation. Remember Muhammad's just-in-time revelations? He finds himself in a pickle. Oh, God has just now given me the answer. And when confronted with this question, God gave him Surah 33, verse 50, which says, O prophet, we've made lawful to thee thy wives to whom thou hast paid their dowries, and to those whom thy right hand possesses. That phrase, those whom thy right hand possesses, is a euphemism for as many slave women as you can handle. So Muslim men were allowed to have sex with as many slave women as they were in possession of, those whom their right hand possesses, out of the prisoners of war whom Allah has assigned to thee. This is for thee and thee alone, and not for the believers at large. So Muhammad was given a specific exemption in the Quran in Surah 33, verse 50, to have as many wives as he wanted. And he did. Over his career, he was married to 17 wives, up to 11 at any one time, simultaneously. But here's an interesting part. Even though the Quran allows Muslim men to marry up to 4 wives, and even though Muhammad could have as many wives as he wanted, when Muhammad's son-in-law, who was married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima, when Muhammad's son-in-law wanted to take a second wife, Muhammad forbade that. He says, you cannot take a wife unless you first divorce my daughter, because what hurts her hurts me. Notice he recognized that to allow his daughter's husband to take on a second wife would hurt her. It would cause her emotional pain. He said, you're not going to take on a second wife, my son-in-law, unless you first divorce my daughter. Can you say hypocrisy? Muhammad only permitted 1 wife for his son-in-law Ali. In Islam, men can divorce wives for any reason at all, or no reason at all. They don't have to have much of an excuse. The divorce is very simple. A Muslim man has to issue the woman what's called the talaq. Talaq is the word for divorce. It has to be a triple talaq. I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. He has to say, I divorce you 3 times. He has to tell the woman, talaq, 3 times. Now, it can be 3 times consecutively in a very short amount of time, or it can be 3 times spread out over a period of time, like a month or 2. But once the woman has been given that 3rd divorce, she's free. She is irrevocably divorced. This is called an irrevocable divorce. After a triple talaq is issued by the husband, that woman cannot marry again, even if she wanted to be reconciled back to that husband. She cannot be reconciled back to that husband. That divorce is irrevocable. Now, this is one of the issues that I spoke about earlier at the beginning of the hour. This is one of the things that Muhammad is said to have instituted to improve the status of women. Because remember, in pre-Islamic societies, men could divorce and remarry their women ad infinitum, as many times as they wanted to. So Muhammad said, he came along and said, well, no more infinite divorces. Now it's 3 only. After the 3rd divorce, women, you're free to go and marry whoever you want. So this is one of the ways that the status of women was improved. It was boosted. Now, there's an exception to that, which we're going to talk about after the break. But women can be divorced from their husbands for any reason at all, or no reason at all. There was an issue, I read an article not too long ago on the internet, where I think it was in Malaysia, where a man was kind of goofing around. He was actually playing a practical joke with his wife on Skype, and they were chatting with each other over Skype. And he just issued the divorce. He says, talak, talak, talak. And he's playing a practical joke. But the Islamic judges discovered that he had told his wife 3 times, I divorce you. And they held that divorce to be irreconcilable. This is how serious that is. He was just playing a practical joke, but it cost him his wife. So men can divorce for any reason, but women do not have the same rights of divorce. A woman cannot tell her husband, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and be able to walk away from him. Now, that's not to say that women can't get a divorce. It is possible for a woman to get a divorce, but she has a much more difficult time. She actually has to essentially put her husband on trial before a judge and give good reasons to the judge why she should be granted a divorce from her husband. It's a much more difficult process. She does not have the same rights of divorce that the man does. Let's play this last video clip and then we'll take a break. Check this out.
ما قيمة أن يكون عندك دابة مطلعة حبة عينك بتوديك مشوار ممكن تركبه في الميكروباص بربع جنيه تصرف عليها 100 جنيه ما تبيعها وتخلص منها. حد يقدر يقول انه لو باع السيارة دي يعيب عليه يخص عليه انه باعها ده مش اصيل ما هي دابة. حد يقدر يقول له واحد تعبان جدا جدا في شقته وشقة جيرانها سوق وهي قليلة المرافق وحالتها بالبلد لو باعها حد يقدر يقول له يا عيبة عليك ازاي انت تبيع دارك ده دي اللي انت اتولدت فيها وقعدت فيها وتربيت فيها وكيت وكيت لكنها لا تصلح الآن. لا تصلح الآن. لها جيران سوء لا راحة لي فيها. وكذلك المرأة. وكذلك المرأة لو امرأة بهذا الخلق السيء ولا راحة معها البتة ما المانع أن تطلق؟ ما المانع أن تطلق؟ احنا يا اخوانا نصارى.
Ooh. So divorcing your wife is no different than getting rid of a car that's costing you too much to maintain, or a house or an apartment that doesn't suit you anymore. If your wife doesn't suit you anymore, just you know, get rid of her. I mean, after all, what are we, Christians? Ouch. See, he recognized something unique in Christianity, didn't he? That's pretty insightful. All right, let's take a break, and we'll come back and continue this discussion.